Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Viral Cultures, Activist Archiving in the Age of AIDS by Marika Cifor. Narrated by Kate Udall. Introduction. For the record, AIDS, archives, and vital nostalgia. If he were alive today, he would be at this opening. If she were alive today, you'd be texting her right now. If he were alive today, he would be going gray. If they were alive today, they could tell you about getting arrested at City Hall. If she were alive today, you'd be so her type. If he were alive today, you would have met him by now. If she were alive today, she would have finished writing that book. If he were alive today, he would have you on your knees. If he were alive today, you'd still be arguing about that. If he were alive today, he'd still be living with AIDS. AIDS stands apart in Fierce Pussy's For the Record. Printed in the retrovirus's signature blood-red hue, AIDS breaks the singularity of the broadside's full-page, all-black text, a creative punctuation, and punctum. Queer Dyke Art Action Collective, Fierce Pussy's text-based artwork reclaims language and public space for HIV/AIDS. With each iteration of if he, she, they were alive today, the broadside intervenes in the strictures of AIDS time. Created in 2013 for arts organization Visual AIDS 24th Day Without Art, it is printed on cheap newsprint, with an intimate catechism of ifs repeating across the windows of New York City bookstore and gallery printed matter. Fierce Pussy transformed the site into a newsstand, taking their installation about the nature and meanings of the AIDS record to Chelsea's bustling sidewalks. For the Record also moved in posters distributed at museums, galleries, and nonprofits, on stickers and postcards, and in downloadable digital editions. Fierce Pussy knew that passerbys would only briefly scan the text, so they emphasized AIDS intentionally. HIV/AIDS, this project asserted, is still breaking news. Fierce Pussy is Nancy Brooks Brody, Joy Episala, Zoe Leonard, and Carrie Yamoka. They met doing AIDS activism in 1991 and have collaborated on arts-based action ever since. These artists were acutely aware that in the 21st century American popular imaginary, AIDS is static. The HIV/AIDS crisis in the United States is demarcated when it surfaces at all in popular culture as a past tragedy, a catalog of long-lost lives and decimated generations. AIDS is routinely marked as irrelevant to the unfolding crises and structural violences of our present, with each recurrent yet distinct utterance of, if he, she, they were alive today. Fierce Pussy speculated in conditional language about what might have happened differently in the epidemic's past, what could happen differently in its persistent present, and what could be different about HIV/AIDS' future. For the Record, in part, is the expected AIDS record, an elegy for dead friends, comrades, and lovers. Its textual performance mourns an accumulation of unbearable losses, utilizing the now commonplace currency of imagining who could have been here and what work could have been accomplished, if not for AIDS. Dominant AIDS narratives highlight treatment activism's political and aesthetic successes, driven by a heroic cast of now-departed AIDS activists. Gay, white, middle-class men who died between 1981 and 1995, during their prime. Thus, aligned in structure and tone with other well-known AIDS artworks, the if-onlys in For the Record appear to focus on the valued lives of acclaimed gay cultural workers, artists, writers, designers, actors, directors, dancers, choreographers. AIDS didn't just deprive us of millions of lives, Edmund White wrote. It deprived us of decades of potential masterpieces of fashion, art, design, theater, and dance. For example, in The Resurrected, White's 2018 New York Times Style magazine article, Keith Haring, 1958 to 1991, who died from AIDS-related causes at 31, is imagined and pictured as he would be at 59. Haring, a gay white, cis-male graffiti activist artist who had already attained art world recognition, is one of 4 geniuses gone to the plague whom White resurrected. In For the Record, too, there are traces of such conventional nostalgia, a potent longing for an earlier time shared with beloveds in the flesh. But significantly, Fierce Pussy refuses to let us stay comfortably in that space of uncritical, restorative yearning. Conversely, Fierce Pussy conjures the dead not as martyrs, but instead as wonderfully ordinary. The artists grant loved ones a mundane present in which they continue the everyday acts that constitute a life: texting, flirting, protesting, museum-going, fucking, talking, working. By making the present the focal point, Fierce Pussy pushes viewers to imagine and enact a different, more livable AIDS time, in which the past continues into the present in ongoing trivial tiffs, celebratory openings, and new relationships. Fierce Pussy, moreover, asserts that mourning and loss are ongoing experiences that do not reside solely in the past. The artists deny cultural pressure to move on, to move past, to let go, to get over it in favor of embracing the future. The AIDS time rendered is neither linear nor progressive. Rather, it is part of a vital nostalgia practice, an activist longing for a pastime that interrogates, addresses, and repairs structural power inequities. Through its unpunctuated litany, For the Record invokes a renewed urgency to curating and archiving as the care work needed to generate the AIDS record and to renew our commitment to HIV/AIDS awareness and action that can engender holistic cure. Fierce Pussy created an AIDS record that requires viewers to reconsider our personal, social, political, and biomedical relationship to AIDS in the 21st century. Highlighting makes the final phrase pivotal. If he were alive today, he'd still be living with AIDS. It repeats with only pronoun variations on the foldouts. Fierce Pussy reminds us that even if the dead were animate, their histories and bodies would still be charged with HIV. Between an earlier epidemic era and our own AIDS time, so much, and yet so little, has changed. There are important advances in HIV treatment that prolong lives and improve their quality. However, even as biotechnology renders HIV a manageable chronic illness for some, it still requires arduous efforts to attain and sustain healthfulness. The virus still persists in infected bodies, living indefinitely in memory T cells containing integrated, transcriptionally silent HIV DNA. Moreover, corporate, medical, and state apparatuses determine access, distribution, and production, rendering life-saving antiretroviral medications inaccessible to many. Vulnerability and risk continue to be unevenly distributed by race, class, gender, sexuality, indigeneity, and carceral, housing, and immigration statuses. AIDS-related suffering and dying continue unabated in many minoritized communities, and an AIDS case plateau that is currently in progress makes a resurgence in new infections possible. HIV/AIDS is still here, and it is still incurable in every sense: biomedical, political, cultural. A holistic AIDS cure demands dismantling the structural injustices that minoritize and marginalize HIV-positive people. Amid the ongoing AIDS pandemic, it remains urgent to use archives and records to raise awareness not only that people who died from AIDS-related causes were once here, but also that people living with HIV continue to be here, and that those stories must be told and retold. The American HIV/AIDS crisis, John Petru argues, needs to be remembered not only as part of the past, but also continuing in a different form into our present. For the Record aims to ensure the everyday realities of AIDS time are documented, preserved, and accessible now and for posterity. In their creation and curatorial mobilization of the record through vital nostalgia, Fierce Pussy demonstrates the high stakes of documenting AIDS in America. Then, now, becoming. Viral Cultures, Activist Archiving in the Age of AIDS, is about how we reckon with the AIDS past in this pandemic present. Archives are becoming as important to understanding AIDS as the biomedical event of HIV/AIDS itself. AIDS archives matter at this conjuncture for three primary reasons. First, archiving, the practices and acts of creating, collecting, preserving, and making accessible political, cultural, and medical knowledge, is a vital component of what Douglas Crimp terms AIDS cultural activism. Knowledge about HIV/AIDS would otherwise be marginalized, suppressed, or forgotten altogether. Curatorial care work, the selection, organization, and maintenance of archives and records, enables them to be activated through creative works and events. Archiving and curation make possible the challenge and transformation of contemporary, neglectful public understandings of the epidemic's persistence and lived experiences of HIV/AIDS. This book is an account of the people, activists, artists, curators, and archivists, and ideologies, temporal, political, technological, cultural, and biomedical, that shape AIDS archives and the cultural productions that animate these records. Second, AIDS archives are produced by and reproduce the conditions of AIDS time. There is a continued urgency to AIDS cultural activism, and AIDS archives have a timely, evolving role to play in meeting and addressing it. In the accelerated registers of epidemic time during the 1980s and early 1990s, AIDS activists responded by enacting the care work that Ben Alexander and Andrew Flynn call activist archiving at a furious pace creating documentation and collecting, preserving, curating, and making these records accessible. They accumulated rich, extensive archives that they mobilized for contemporaneous social change and that now shape the representation and conditions of HIV/AIDS with meaningful idiosyncrasies, erasures, redactions, and highlights. Almost immediately, in the wake of 1996 biomedical breakthroughs, the advent of a more effective combination therapy of antiretrovirals for HIV and AIDS treatment, there was a shift in AIDS time. We entered, and remain, in an age of presumed HIV survivability and of ubiquitous end of AIDS declarations. The perceived urgency and relevance of documenting, collecting, and responding to HIV/AIDS was quickly evacuated. It is the records of a pre-1996 AIDS time that have been created, collected, and preserved for posterity by archives. Reckoning with 21st century AIDS culture requires examining AIDS archives. We need to critically engage with activist archiving. The archival care activists do as part of their efforts to engender social change, and with archiving activism, public and private archival institutions collecting, maintenance, use, and mediations of records created by AIDS activists. Curation and archiving are practices of care enacted in activist archiving and archiving activism. Finally, we are in a cultural moment that, amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic, is revisiting AIDS activism with a kind of nostalgia, but not the vital nostalgia that is going to be generative for AIDS cultural activism. From the 2010s onward, we have witnessed a proliferation of popular and scholarly AIDS crisis revisitations that are fundamentally grounded in the archival. These works are constructing what is known and knowable about HIV/AIDS through progressive narratives. Routinely, such narratives recenter gay, white, middle-class men as representative of AIDS activists and their treatment activism as a stand-in for AIDS activism as a whole. AIDS archives are positioned by such cultural productions as the location of the end of AIDS, framing AIDS and its archives as relics of a distant past defangs contemporary AIDS crises in the United States, marking them as satisfyingly and safely over in the popular imaginary. Thus, simplistic historization of AIDS can result in its depoliticization. However, there persists a deep, generationally inflicted longing for the radical queer politics, coalitional community, and provocative aesthetics of pre-1996 AIDS activism. AIDS archival records, the people and systems that generate, collect, and care for them, and the ways that they are activated by activists, artists, curators, and archivists clearly merit a critical examination now. Despite the wave of scholarship, popular media, exhibitions, memorials, and other cultural productions on American AIDS activism during the 1980s and 1990s, the archives of AIDS on which such projects are built have not received proper attention. Viral Cultures examines the creation of AIDS records then and the activation of AIDS archival records now. How we engage with AIDS archives in the 21st century dictates more than HIV/AIDS past. AIDS archives shape possible presents and futures and the distribution of life chances. Records, when harnessed through vital nostalgia, hold the power to be mobilized as forces that repoliticize AIDS and reinvest AIDS time with palpable urgency. Viral Cultures demonstrates how nostalgia shapes the ways we record and remember in, with, and through AIDS archives. Nostalgia has long been dismissed and derided by scholars and popular commentators as a politically conservative, self-indulgent wallowing in the past that stands in the way of present and future social change. Using case studies from my ethnographic data, I center the vital potential of nostalgia as recorded and produced by archives documenting 1980s and 1990s AIDS activism in the United States. Vital nostalgia, the analytic inaugurated in this book, is a generative practice for interrogating, addressing, and repairing structural power inequities grounded in the bittersweet longing for a past time or space. This is the nostalgia we need amid crises and their aftermaths. Vital nostalgia enables a more complicated understanding of archives as both the site of AIDS historization and as the most powerful bulwark against dangerous end-of-AIDS narratives. Vital nostalgia names the critical examination of the present through an ongoing relation to the past. When activated within processes of vital nostalgia, AIDS archives showcase how activists and people living with HIV/AIDS are coping, struggling, and thriving with AIDS, not as the epidemic ends, but as it continues to unfold. Archives have powerful roles to play in developing a holistic, complex, cultural cure for HIV's harms, to stem further suffering and death, and to improve life chances and quality for those continually marginalized. The temporal and affective drag of holding on to the past in such a vital nostalgic practice is about its political potentiality for feeling, imagining, and enacting a different, more just present and future. Ultimately, ethical, scholarly, curatorial, and activist archiving practices must harness vital nostalgia in order to actively engage and serve diverse AIDS archival constituencies, past, present, and future. AIDS and its temporal orders. Tell the story of my life from 0 hour to 12 a.m., from the good to the bad. Tell the tale, save my life, a life I could have had just like Scheherazade, sings youthful, white, queer, well-muscled, leotard-clad Zero. He croons while contact juggling a disco ball and performing aerobatic feats to the accompaniment of synchronized swimmers. In the weird, wonderful opening number of Zero Patients, a movie musical about AIDS, we witness the melodic plight of a posthumous protagonist, the ghost of Patient Zero. Activist and filmmaker John Grayson's 1993 new queer cinema masterpiece was inspired by the true story of Gaëtan Dugas, 1953 to 1984. Dugas, a French-Canadian flight attendant, was damningly misidentified in a 1984 epidemiological visualization as Patient Zero for the North American AIDS epidemic's contagion. In Randy Schultz's 1987 And the Band Played On, Dugas appeared as a sociopath who intentionally infected, or at minimum, recklessly endangered, a promiscuous gay sexual network in coastal urban meccas. We were boys who loved our bodies, playing hard, boys who thought they'd live forever, Zero sings, reflecting the much nostalgicized, fleeting 1970s era of gay white sexual liberation. He marks that era's abrupt terminus with the advent of AIDS. We didn't know we were playing for keeps. It is Zero's mission to find someone to, he repeats in the chorus, tell the story, clear my name. Why do they need someone to blame? Dugas was not cleared of his alleged crimes until 2016. As the musical number closes, the chorus of swimmers repeats the refrain, tell the story, tell the story, tell the story. In my AIDS activism origin story, we are in early 1990s San Francisco, on the precipice of a dot-com boom. My grandmother has ventured out from her Midwestern suburb to visit us, my father, mother, and preschooler me. We are walking through Union Square. Looking down, my grandma pauses, shocked, then asks, "What happened?" On the ground around us are chalk outlines of bodies piled upon bodies. It looks as if we stumbled onto a crime scene. We stand there in what appears to be the aftermath of a massacre, carried out amid the high-end department stores, posh hotels, and holiday ice rink. My mother explains that no, there had not been a crime, at least not in the conventional sense. This was the remains of an AIDS coalition to unleash power, act up, die in, an iconic choreography of protest, performed by activists who mimic corpses. By mirroring, in their embodied acts, the mass death of the AIDS epidemic, activists drew attention to the willful malfeasance perpetuated by the state, media, and public. The chalk outlines of bodies on the sidewalk likely faded quickly under the continuous assault of passing feet, but this memory of AIDS encounter has stuck with me. Human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, and acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, biomedically describes a broad spectrum of conditions caused by the body's acquisition of the HIV virion through the exchange of certain bodily fluids. While its circulation in the United States dates back to the late 1960s, the medical community first clinically observed what would become known as AIDS in 1981. Its earliest recognized manifestations were in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York City, among clusters of homosexual men who were diagnosed with previously rare opportunistic infections. These infections, Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis pneumonia, generally affect only those with severely compromised immune systems. That men with expectations of good health and access to health care were affected led to recognition of a more momentous epidemiological event. Later that year, as word of a deadly new disease spread through gay communities, the New York Times first reported to the general public the possibility of an emergent epidemic under the headline, "Rare Cancer Seen in 41 Homosexuals." While the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, recognized AIDS in 1981, its cause, means of infection, and scale remained unknown for the next few years. A toxic mixture of paranoia and scientific ignorance created widespread panic. Politicians and the media amplified these characteristics, leading to a popular hysteria, an embrace of fear-driven suspicions, and the shunning of entire groups. In its early years, AIDS was frequently identified in the press as gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID. While it was not then and is not now a virus affecting only men who have sex with men, the symbolic and material association of HIV/AIDS with sex, homosexuality, and the LGBTQ community was and remains important. Materially, many of the best-known early HIV/AIDS responses came from gay and lesbian communities. In the early 1980s, facing widespread and far-reaching neglect, stigma, and discrimination from the state, mainstream media, pharmaceutical companies, healthcare and insurance providers, families and religious organizations, And as the death counts rapidly rose, gays and lesbians organized.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?